All right, thank you very much. Yeah, hi, I'm Benedict from Reckoner Industries. We're here to showcase our game, The Signal State. First, I'd like to thank the SGGA and thank Cheryl for inviting us to showcase our game in the first place. Yeah, we really appreciate the opportunity. So to start off, let's introduce who we are. We're Reckoner Industries. We are a local indie game startup. We started this company last year around March or so, like right around when COVID started. Like the perfect time to start a risky business venture. We are a duo consisting of myself and my colleague Ark. For personal reasons, he's remaining pseudonymous, and I'll be the one handling the presentation as well. And alongside the two of us, we are making this game with a team of like part-time freelancers from Singapore as well as from around the world. We are also generously supported by our publisher, the Iterative Collective. I'm not going to say much about them. Matthew from Iterative, he's got a session later. He's going to talk about the incubation program that they're starting up, and I think that's something you should take a look at later. So anyway, to our game, the Signal State. So what is it exactly? The Signal State is a puzzle slash simulation game that's inspired by modular synthesizers and electronics engineering. In the fiction, you play as a settler in a post-apocalypse on an abandoned farm. You're attempting to rebuild this farm and rebuild society. And how you do that is you're resurrecting the machines on this farm, and you're doing so by like basically rewiring them and like hacking into them and you do so with this interface that is inspired by modular synthesizers, inspired by electronics engineering. You're transforming input signals into output signals, and you have this toolkit of cables and modules that you use to then transform these signals to match certain objectives. And we're going to see that in action in a bit. The story is told through these interactive dialogues. Every puzzle is bookended by a dialogue, and in these dialogue systems, you learn more about the story, you learn more of the characters and the world, and also you get some tips and tricks as to how to play the game. As to the actual gameplay, let's take a look how it starts off. So this is just screenshots from the tutorial. You start off with a brief. And the brief is just really it's a bit of text that basically gives you your objectives. What exactly you're supposed to do in this particular puzzle. So in this example, you're given one input signal, and you have to send that input signal, identical copies of the input signal, to two outputs. So then how do you go about doing that? Right? So you start with given inputs, they're called source signals in the game, and then you transform them, you send them to the out signals. In this particular puzzle, it's quite a simple one. You have a single module that can take an input signal and split it out to multiple output signals. And then you can use that and connect them up, and that's how you solve this puzzle. And then as you can see at the bottom, there's like these waveforms. So that's the waveform graph, which shows your input signals and the output signals that you have to match. And if you successfully assemble a circuit that successfully solves for that puzzle, you can press play, and the signals play back. And you can see the numerical readout to see that whether you successfully achieved that particular puzzle's objective. Now, this is a very simple example, but obviously in the game we have like over 40 puzzles, and they all get increasingly complex. You have a bunch of different modules, each with their own discrete behavior, and they often can work in a way that's orthogonal to each other that leads to more complexity. So they have multiple inputs, multiple outputs. They have adjustable controls that change their behavior, and you can get really complex puzzles that have a lot of interesting outcomes and make you think about math and logic in really interesting ways. Yeah, so now, you've seen a brief sort of overview of this game idea. It's hard to explain. It's hard to really get a sense of how it works until you play it for yourself. But I think you can sort of surmise from that brief overview that it's kind of a niche idea. It's a pretty complex puzzle game. It's not a simple casual puzzle game, and it's not a conventional puzzle platformer or anything like that. So I think one of the immediate questions you might ask is, why are we working on such a niche idea? Right, and the reasoning for that is there's two major aspects of it, right? There's the design motivations for it, as well as the practical considerations. And I'll start with the practical considerations. First of all, it's a small team. There's basically two of us as the core team, and then some freelancers. And the two core members of the team, we don't really do any art. We're not artists. We're designers or programmers or whatnot. And because of that, it kind of limits the kind of genres we can work in. We can't work in an animation or art-heavy genre, for instance. So that's part of the issue. Then there's also other wider sort of market-wide considerations, like with the advent of Steam and the fact that Steam now is open up to pretty much anyone, it's hard to get your game discovered. And if you work in a mainstream genre, maybe you're making an indie FPS or like a puzzle platformer or something like that, I think it can potentially be really difficult for you to stand out from the crowd, for people to find your game and discover your game. Not unless you have the budget or resources or the know-how to do like a big marketing push or something like that, or if your game can go viral in some way. And the third one is a very sort of local specific one, which is that, Singapore is a relatively expensive country to live in. And also, we're in the middle of a global epidemic that is making the socio-economic environment here, as well as overseas, kind of, a bit more complicated, to put it mildly. So, if you have a higher cost of living, it also means a higher cost of failure because your budget has to account for the fact that just to survive, you need more money. And also, if you do fail and you have no more money, then you're in an even bigger financial hole, right? So that kind of is a sort of calculus that you have to take into account when you're deciding what to make. And so one of the things that we did was to basically kind of sidestep these concerns by working in something that's kind of left field. And it's what you might call an invisible market niche, to use a term that Bennett Foddy. So those screenshots there are from a tweet thread by the game developer Bennett Foddy, and he was talking about some of the games he found on Steam. Right, he had this whole thread of game examples of games that sold well. At least you can tell they sold well because they have a lot of Steam reviews. Usually that has some sort of correlation with sales. But then if you search for them on Kotaku or Polygon or whatever, right, or Metacritic, you'll find that there's virtually no mainstream press coverage whatsoever. So we have all these games, no mainstream press coverage, but has like they've sold really well, right? So we have this conventional idea that Steam has led to oversaturation of games, and to some extent it's probably true. But but his conclusion was that that Steam has also unlocked markets for niche game genres that were previously really sort of underserved because there was no avenue and no opportunity for people to make that sort of game. But now that Steam kind of provides that. So we decided to make a game that is in this sort of invisible market niche, that is a kind of a niche genre, but could potentially have a pretty decent audience to it. It's still a risky venture, and we'll talk about that sort of risks and what those risks are later on. But also, the dynamics of those risks and the consequences of those risks are quite different. So I can talk about the design motivations next, I guess. That's maybe a bit more interesting. So I've always been a fan of the Zectronics game Shunshun-IO, as well as some of the precursors like TIS 100. Like Zectronics games have made this really niche sort of genres of puzzle games where you're doing very complex problem solving, right? The subgenre itself kind of is named after the company. They're called Zack-likes, right? So in the top left, that's Shunshun-IO. It's you're designing electronic circuits and programming them in assembly. That is very nerdy. That is very niche. That's also like I love it, right? So that's great. So it's a thing of like there is a template for games that are kind of like this that already exist. So that's kind of nice. But then of course I can't just rip that off, right? So one of my other sort of side hobbies, passions, and also like a side gig, I've done some freelance audio work, is that I'm really interested in like electronic music and music production and like synthesizers, and modular synthesizers in particular is something that I find really cool. Like so the bottom right is what you call a modular synth. That one's mine actually. If you look in the background, you might be able to see it. A modular synthesizer is it's like a standard sort of synthesizer that you might think of, like a keyboard synthesizer, except all of the components that make a synthesizer, the oscillators, the filters, right? They're sort of separated out into individual modules, and these individual modules they do different things. And in a modular synthesizer, it's a lot more flexible. You can interconnect between these modules and just change the sound that you're getting, and then you can also patch different modules from different manufacturers that can do different things. And as I started playing with these modular synthesizers, and I started writing music in them, I started understanding them, I kind of started to notice that there is a very similar pattern to how I think about these synthesizers, how I solve problems in these synthesizers then, and it's kind of similar to how I would do programming. That you're starting with some idea of what you want to accomplish, and you have to break that idea, that objective essentially down into certain component bits of like, if I want to have this sound, I'll need to connect this oscillator into this filter, and then I'll need to get a CV in output of this LFO to modulate the cutoff, and then I need to use a sequencer to modulate the frequency of the LFO. And right, it's breaking it down to steps. It's getting it very procedural. It's very programming like. And so the idea came to me of like, what if we can make a game that's kind of inspired by that? What if we can make a game that is about problem solving in a way that isn't so intimidating with like writing code, but is a bit maybe a bit more visual and a bit less abstract, but feels a bit more like you're operating on some physical hardware. Because that's one of the things that I like about modular synths, that it's very physical. And so I started prototyping and working on the idea. So the first iteration of this game was a prototype I made in university called Radio Resistance. There's you can play that version, but obviously not as polished as the final game. And through developing that prototype, I noticed that okay, there's potential to this idea. There's a lot of interesting consequences of these systems that I put together, right? And I've not really formally verified it, but I think like the system that we built in there is essentially Turing complete. Like you can make infinite loops out of them and whatnot. And then we built a new prototype that is kind of showcase the game idea better, and then we pitched it to the Iterative Collective. We signed a deal, and then we're been developing the game for, close to a year now. And the bottom right is sort of the final state of it. We're close to goal, and we hope to release it later this year. So then you can see it on Steam later, and I'll have a Steam link later that you can take a look at. We also have a playable demo that you can try out for now. So, like I mentioned, it's a niche game, right? It's a niche game. It has its own risks involved, and those risks have those own consequences, right? And these are some of those risks involved. So one of the first questions I started asking myself is just, am I just ripping off a Zachtronics game? Am I just ripping off, Shinshin.io? Because when you're working in a niche genre, right? When you're working in a niche genre, there's not a lot of examples of games to take reference from. If you're working on an FPS, there are infinite FPSs to take reference from. If you're working on a niche puzzle game that's inspired by synthesizers and programming, then the number of games you can take reference from is significantly smaller. And if there's not a lot to take reference from, there's a possibility that you're taking a lot of reference from one game or a couple of games, and you're ending up in a situation where your game looks very similar to existing games, which is an issue in terms of artistic and moral integrity, but also if you're making something similar to something that already exists, why would people play your thing, right? So that's one of the things that I wanted to avoid. The next sort of concern was, is the niche already oversaturated? Because it's the question of like, it's a niche genre, but maybe it's niche because the audience isn't that big to begin with. And that's a hard question to answer as well, because, with a niche genre, you have very little market data to deal with, right? Again, like if you're making an FPS, there's a lot of FPS games where you can try and get the market data for those FPS games and trying to get a sense of what potential audience you might have. It's a lot harder for a niche genre because there's just so few games to get sales data from, right? And believe me, we tried. And the last is, assuming there's even a niche, there's an audience that you could potentially serve. Does your game idea even satisfy that audience? It's a thing of, if it's a niche audience, then it's also hard to get people to test the idea and like sanity check that the idea is actually interesting. So like early on in the development of the Signal State, I found it very hard to get playtesters who were familiar with the genre. Even in university, when I was showing Radio Resistance, right, the sort of feedback I could get from instructors was pretty much only like general stuff, like this is how you make the UI a bit more readable, this is how you make the difficulty curve a bit better, but they can never really give validation to the central thesis of the game. They kind of never really give confirm that a game is enjoyable to begin with, because none of them actually like that kind of thing because it's such a niche genre. So it's hard to get that validation, and it can be kind of scary sometimes to then work on a game for very long without being able to get that validation. So the question is, how do we get that validation that there's an audience for this game, you're not ripping off an existing game, and that the audience actually wants to play your game. And for a niche genre, then the only really way to answer these questions is to like put it out there. And we kind of did, in a sense that as part of Steam Next Fest a couple months back, we put out a playable demo with about 10 levels or so, and we started getting responses from people, and those responses were really encouraging. So we started getting feedback on the Steam discussion forums for the game. We started getting feedback on our Discord, and as well as on Twitter of people giving, really positive feedback about the game. We didn't really get much in terms of like negative feedback, and all of the feedback that we're getting about things they wanted to change about the game was really sort of constructive feedback of like, the scoring system could be improved, and certain aspects of the UI could be improved. But all of it was a central validation of the game idea that, yeah, this is actually encouraging. A lot of people were saying, oh, this is a day one purchase for me, which is, very nice to hear. And also that shows in statistics in that we're looking at our Steam wish lists, and we're seeing steady growth, and that's really nice to see, and it's really encouraging to see, and it gives a lot of validation of the central game idea. But then, yeah, that's still the big risk of like a niche game. You kind of have to wait a while before you can get the validation that what you're doing will find its audience. Especially if this is the first type of that game that you're making. But it's encouraging to see, and we're hoping to get we'll see how it turns out when it gets released, and see how it does sales wise, and what final feedback we'll get when you get the final game out. And yeah, I think that about covers it. I think the single state will be released later this year. It'll be available on PC and Mac. There's a playable demo right now at a Steam link. You can also wishlist the game if what you've seen kind of really interests you. And if you want to talk more about a game or contact us, the website link there will give you our Discord, email address, press kit, whatnot. And yeah, thank you all for your time. And I think we might take questions if there are any.
Sorry. Hi, Benedict.
Yeah, hi.
Thank you so much for that presentation. So, yep, just give me a moment. Let me just try check on questions for now.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, I think maybe a question from me. Like, after this game, right, is there like a next game in plan that you guys are maybe already like starting to ideate or work on?
We've had preliminary discussions, but it's a thing also. It's also a complication of my colleague Ark. He's not working on a game full time. He's working part time, and so there's the issue of synchronization of like he doesn't as, he doesn't have as much time to work on this game or work on future ideas as I do. So it's hard to get progress on like a next prototype. But we've had some discussions on what the next steps are at the very least. Yeah.
Okay, give me a moment. So let me just hang there and check out if we have any other questions. Okay. I think it's pretty straightforward and there isn't much questions. So yep, thank you so much, Benedict. Thank you so much for your time.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I've shared the link to the Steam store for Signal State via our social medias as well. So
Cool. Thanks.
hopefully looking forward to playing the game as well.
Yeah.
If I
Thank
had
you.
time
Thank you.
for it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for having me.